My mother tried to lock me in a psych ward to steal my money. She thought it was her perfect plan, but she had no idea how it would end. All right, let's be honest. My name is Alex. I'm 25, and my mom is a complete nightmare. No, seriously, not the sweet mom who bakes cookies and hugs you at night, but more like a villain mom from a bad thriller. We hadn't spoken for several years. I tried to get as far away from that chaos as I could the moment I had the chance. You know the classic scenario: move out, find a decent job, start living your own life without the constant, "you're doing everything wrong again." I was living it up, enjoying my freedom, and then, bam, she came back, with new concerns and the same old familiar manipulations. So, here's the deal. My grandfather passed away a year ago. I loved that old man. He was the only one in the family who really gave me the space to be myself. And honestly, after his death, I inherited quite a substantial sum. Yeah, I'm like new money now. And that's when all the drama started. My mom immediately caught the scent of cash and somehow managed to worm her way back into my life. You get it, right? As soon as she smelled money, she tried to crawl back in, pretending to be the caring mom. At first, she played the role of the good mom, as if she'd been coached by an old movie. "Oh, honey, I'm so happy for you. You've really grown up. Everything is going so well for you." The fakeness gave me chills. But I, being the naive fool, thought maybe, just maybe, she had changed. I tried to keep my distance, but she always found a way to intrude, like a rusty needle through soft fabric. Stuff like, "Let me help you with your affairs, your money, you need support, don't you?" Yeah, right. As if she cared about me and not about those damn dollars. For the first couple of weeks, everything seemed somewhat normal. She'd call, sometimes even drop by, pretending to care. I thought I could just keep her at arm's length. But one day, we're sitting at my place and she says, "Alex, I've started noticing that you've been acting a bit off lately. Maybe you should talk to someone, a doctor perhaps. You know how important mental health is." What the hell? I look at her like she just told me she believes in aliens, but she keeps going. "You just seem a little upset, maybe even depressed. I'm worried about you, you know?" At the time, I thought she was just finding a new way to control me emotionally, like before. But it turned out to be much worse. After that bizarre conversation about the doctor, I started noticing that my mom was up to something suspicious again. But I had no idea just how far things would go. A few days later, she began spreading rumors among our relatives and acquaintances. She'd say stuff like, "Alex seems strange lately. I think he might be depressed." Depressed? Why the hell would she suddenly decide I needed some diagnosis about my mental state? It was so unexpected and absurd that I didn't even realize at first how much she was manipulating the situation. Then distant relatives started calling me, asking how I was, as if I was going through some crisis. You know what was especially surprising? Many of them hadn't spoken to me in years, and now they were suddenly showing all this concern. But it was clearly not genuine. It was like a show my mom had decided to stage, making everyone think I had real problems. But the real shocker came a few days later when people in white coats showed up at my door. Actual doctors. They were talking to me as if I was on the brink of some breakdown. One of them calmly said, "We're just here to make sure you're okay, Alex. Your mother is worried about you." At first, I didn't understand what they were talking about, but then I saw her. My mom was standing not far away, trying to put on the most concerned and caring face. At that moment, I was speechless. My own mother, the person who should have been supporting me, had called in a psychiatric team on me. All this just to force me into an examination. If I hadn't been so shocked, I would have laughed. But the situation was so absurd that it wasn't funny. The doctors kept insisting it was for my own good and that the evaluation was entirely voluntary. But we all know that if you refuse, they start seeing you as the problem. Of course, my mom started playing her role. "Alex, I'm just worried about you. You know I only want what's best for you," she said in such a way that it almost seemed like the truth. but I could already see where this was headed. Her plan was simple: prove that I'm mentally unstable and then gain control over my finances. She knew that if she could declare me mentally unfit, she'd legally become my guardian. And that's when the real battle began. I tried to stay calm and told the doctors that I was fine, but they seemed to take it very seriously. My mom had clearly convinced them that I was in trouble, and they believed her. At that moment, I realized that if I didn't handle this smartly, I could end up in a psychiatric hospital by court order. And then, well, you can imagine what would happen next. Control over my money, my documents, and basically my entire life would go to her. I couldn't let that happen. But the weirdest part was that my mom acted like nothing was wrong. She kept insisting, "It's only for a couple of days, Alex. You know this is for your own good." Her face had that fake smile plastered on it, and I realized she thought she'd won. But honestly, that just made me more determined. I wasn't going to go down without a fight. Standing there, facing these doctors in white coats, I couldn't believe this was really happening. My mom was right beside me, trying to look so concerned, as if she was actually saving me from some imaginary disaster. The doctors spoke in calm tones. "Alex, we just want to make sure you're all right." Seriously? Make sure I'm all right? I was perfectly fine, except for the fact that my mom had orchestrated this entire farce. And that's when I realized that if I lost my temper or started arguing with them, they would immediately interpret it as unstable behavior. The doctors kept insisting that the examination was voluntary and that I should just agree to it so everyone could feel at ease. They were trying to sell me this idea as something harmless and innocent. But I was already beginning to understand that this was anything but simple. My mom stood there, looking at me like I was a helpless child, and it was so infuriating that I was boiling inside. I turned to her and asked, "Do you even realize what you're doing? Do you really think this is a normal way to show you care?" But she didn't flinch. "Alex, please, it's just for your own good. I'm worried about you. You've been acting so strange lately." And that's when I realized she wasn't going to stop. Her goal wasn't to truly help me, but to prove that I was mentally unstable. Because if she managed to do that, she'd gain control over my money, my property, my entire life. She knew that if she could convince the doctors that I was a danger to myself, they could make a decision to have me involuntarily committed. And that's no joke. I tried explaining to the doctors that I was fine, that my mother was exaggerating, and that all of this was just the result of her overbearing nature. But they were clearly already on her side. The most interesting part was that my mother played her role to perfection. She spoke in a calm, caring voice, as if she were the ideal mother willing to do anything for her child's well-being. Her face was so sincere that any outsider would have believed her story. That's when I realized, if I didn't start acting carefully, the situation could spiral out of control. I decided not to argue with the doctors to avoid making things worse. "All right," I said. "If you really need my consent for this, let's just get it over with quickly." The doctors immediately smiled and started typing something on their tablets. My mother probably saw it as her triumph, but I already knew this was just the beginning. Inside, I was boiling with emotions. I understood that I could no longer trust her. Her only goal was to gain control over my life. She had already set all possible levers in motion to achieve that. And if I didn't act fast, she would take everything I had. At that moment, I realized that I couldn't let her win. But this was just the start, and I knew tougher challenges were ahead. Now I understood that my mother was willing to do anything to get what she wanted, and this was a new level of manipulation I wasn't prepared for. But one thing was clear: I wasn't going to surrender. After this little show with the doctors, I realized that I needed to act quickly and decisively. Staying on the defensive was not an option. My mother had played her card, and I knew that if I let her keep going, she wouldn't stop until she took everything she wanted. So, I decided to strike back. The first thing I did was contact a lawyer. Yeah, it might sound like a cliché move, but I needed a strategy. I had to find a way not just to protect myself, but to show that everything my mother was doing was one big manipulation. The lawyer quickly grasped the situation. He told me that things could get serious if I didn't start gathering evidence of my mother's inappropriate behavior. I started digging. All of her past actions that had once seemed odd or suspicious to me were now beginning to fit into one big picture. I found out that she had already tried to pull something like this with one of her ex-husbands, claiming his instability and trying to gain control of his finances through the court. But back then, she failed, and the story was swept under the rug. Apparently, she had learned from her mistakes and decided to try her luck with me. Fortunately, I wasn't alone in my suspicions. One of our mutual acquaintances, someone who had long witnessed her financial tricks, decided to help me gather evidence of her past schemes. We started digging deeper and uncovered a whole archive of documents and witnesses who could confirm that my mother had repeatedly tried to use people for her own selfish purposes. This wasn't just manipulation in the context of family disputes. It was a well-developed scheme she'd been perfecting for years. Another important step was to gather evidence that I was completely fine. I booked an appointment with a psychiatrist who, by the way, was surprised that I even had such concerns in the first place. He listened to my story, ran a few tests, and of course, found no signs of instability. This was the first real step toward dismantling all of her plans. Naturally, my mother suspected nothing. She continued to build her schemes as if nothing had happened. She probably thought I had just accepted that her plan was working and was now resigned to my fate. But as I began gathering real information, I realized that not only did I have a chance to come out of this victorious, but I could also completely destroy her manipulations. And you know what's the funniest part? She kept acting like she had everything under control. Every conversation was dripping with fake concern, which she was so good at portraying. She'd call me and say how it hurt her to see me in such a state, how she was afraid for my future. And every time I heard her voice, something inside me clicked. I saw right through her now. Every step, every word. It was all part of her grand plan. But I was no longer the naive son she once knew. I was preparing a response that would shock her. This was just the beginning of my game. Of course, my mother thought everything was going according to her plan. She believed her lies and manipulations had worked, and that her concerned mother act had convinced everyone, including the doctors and our relatives. But as soon as my lawyer gathered all the necessary documents, we filed a lawsuit to stop her attempts to have me declared mentally unstable and gain control of my money. As the case moved towards trial, I could see my mother starting to get nervous. She was still trying to maintain her composure, but her phone calls became increasingly tense. Every time she called, her voice had a slight edge to it, and I could hear the anxiety creeping in. "Alex, I'm still so worried about you," she would say, but her fake concern no longer had any effect on me. I knew she could feel the control slipping from her grasp. Then came the day of the trial. To say my mother came prepared is an understatement. She brought an entire army of witnesses ready to testify that I was allegedly in a dangerous mental state. But the moment she walked into the courtroom, I saw the cracks in her confidence. She, of course, played her part until the end, but her eyes gave away that she hadn't expected things to escalate this far. She thought she could resolve it without going to court, but I had forced her onto the stage where she could no longer control the narrative. At first, she tried to convince the judge that her only goal was to help me. She spoke in a soft voice, trying to evoke sympathy from everyone. "I just want my son to be safe," she kept repeating. Her lawyer supported this narrative, claiming that everything she did was out of motherly love and concern. But as soon as my lawyer started speaking, everything changed. My lawyer presented documents to the court proving that my mother had attempted similar schemes with her ex-husbands and other relatives. All of her past manipulations were laid bare. The judge began to look at the case very differently. Now everyone could see that this wasn't just a concerned mother, but someone who had systematically tried to use others for her own gain. And when my mother realized her plan was falling apart, she began to lose her composure. Her calm demeanor vanished, and her face showed clear signs of panic. She started interrupting my lawyer, claiming that these documents had nothing to do with the case, that it was in the past, and that she was a completely different person now. But all of it sounded incredibly unconvincing. The judge listened carefully, and the more my mother spoke, the clearer it became that she had fallen into the trap she'd set herself. Her attempts to paint me as mentally unstable were starting to look like desperate moves to gain control of my inheritance. And in that moment, I realized that the tide was turning in my favor. When the judge asked my mother to explain why she had insisted so strongly on the psychiatric evaluation, she started stammering. Her voice trembled, and she gave incoherent excuses. It seemed she finally realized her lies had been exposed. I watched, understanding that her game was coming to an end. When my lawyer finished his statement, everything started to fall into place. The judge had finally figured out who he was dealing with, and my mother's carefully crafted performance began to crumble before everyone's eyes. She could no longer maintain the facade of a caring mother. Her calm demeanor had evaporated, but I knew she wouldn't give up that easily. Just when everything seemed to be going my way, my mother made a last, desperate move. She began pleading, saying it was all for my own good, and that she was just worried about her son. Her voice lacked the confidence it once had, and it seemed like she was on the verge of breaking down. But she kept going. "Alex, I'm only trying to help. Can't you see how much you've changed?" Her words sounded like a final cry for help, but by then, no one believed her anymore. At that moment, my lawyer stood up and revealed something I hadn't expected. He presented the evidence we had gathered over the past few weeks, documents proving her financial schemes with her previous husbands. It turned out she had not only tried to pull this stunt with me, but had also previously attempted to gain control over other people's finances in exactly the same way. I felt my anger rise as I heard my lawyer detail all these incidents. My mother never expected that we would uncover so many skeletons from her past. The judge listened carefully, and all traces of sympathy for her disappeared from his face. Her entire act of being a caring mother was falling apart. This was the moment when her past caught up with her, and everyone saw her true nature. Then things got really interesting. Seeing her plan unravel, my mother lost whatever composure she had left. She started yelling in the courtroom, interrupting the judge and my lawyer. "It's all lies! He set this all up!" Her accusations sounded pitiful, and no one believed a word she said. At that moment, I knew she had truly lost. The judge called a recess to review all the evidence, and I stepped into the hallway with my lawyer. We both knew the end was near. As we discussed our next steps, my mother suddenly approached me. I wasn't sure what to expect, but her face was twisted with rage and fear. "How could you?" she hissed. "You've ruined everything. You'll regret this." Her threats no longer held any power over me. I just stood there, silently staring at her, knowing that she had backed herself into a corner. Her plan had failed, and now she would have to face the consequences of everything she had done. We returned to the courtroom, and the judge finally delivered his verdict. The whole story about my mental health issues was dismissed as fabricated, and my mother received a formal warning for making false accusations. But that wasn't the end. She could be facing real legal consequences for all the schemes we had uncovered. She had tried to destroy my life, but now everything was turning against her. When the judge read the decision, the room fell completely silent. My mother, who had been playing the role of the perfect, caring parent just moments before, sat frozen in shock. Her plan, which she had so meticulously crafted, had collapsed in front of everyone. No one in the room believed her anymore, and no one sympathized with her concerns. This was the moment when she completely lost control, not just over me, but over her entire reputation. The judge not only rejected her request for my evaluation, but also insisted on a further investigation into her actions. Now she was facing real legal repercussions for all the financial schemes my lawyer had so carefully unearthed. It was like a snowball effect. One revelation led to another. The whole plot with the psychiatric lie and her attempt to take control of my money was just the tip of the iceberg. When the session ended, my mother was the first to leave the courtroom, not saying a word. I watched as she slipped out, avoiding everyone's gaze. She used to love being the center of attention, always flaunting her power and control. But now she was a shadow of the person I once knew. I realized this wasn't the end for her. She had many more unpleasant moments ahead. In the days following the trial, I started receiving calls from family members apologizing for having believed her. No one had expected that she was capable of such actions. Her behavior had torn the family apart. Those who once stood by her now wanted nothing to do with her. She was no longer the strong woman they had admired. She had become a burden. The most interesting part came a few weeks later. After the court ruling, I filed a counterclaim for emotional damages, for the false accusations, and for her attempts to manipulate my life through the legal system. This wasn't just a response to her actions, it was my chance to make her truly pay for everything she had done. When she was notified of the counterclaim, her situation became critical. All her assets were frozen, and her property was seized. Her reputation was completely destroyed, and that meant no one would ever believe her again. It was her total downfall. She could no longer use her victim persona or manipulate people the way she used to. She was left alone, without support or resources. I heard that she tried to leave the city and sell off what little she had left, but it didn't work out for her. At that moment, I realized that justice had finally been served. She had lost everything that had once mattered to her because she had overestimated her power and underestimated me. Her downfall was inevitable. After all the court cases, the revelations, and the asset freezes, my mother was left with nothing. She tried to disappear from everyone, becoming more and more isolated with each passing day. This was the end of her game, the end of her schemes, and, most importantly, the end of her control over me. But for me, this was only the beginning. The counterclaim I filed served as another blow. She was charged with making false statements and attempting to manipulate the legal system, leading to yet another trial. My lawyers worked diligently and objectively, gathering every tiny detail of her past frauds. Now she was at the mercy of the courts and facing new charges. She was no longer in control of anything. Her life was now dictated by others. When I was informed that the court had ruled in my favor on the counterclaim, I felt an immense sense of relief. I didn't just win money, I won my freedom from her influence. My mother was ordered to pay compensation for emotional damages and for all her attempts to manipulate the situation. And this wasn't just financial punishment, it was the moment when her world truly crumbled. I was free at last. But the most shocking part came later. One day, a mutual acquaintance called me to say that my mother had tried to flee the city, but had been detained due to outstanding debts and other legal issues. She was in complete financial ruin. Everything she had tried to build through manipulation and control had now been destroyed. She was left with nothing. No money, no reputation, and no family support. Of course, I didn't feel sorry for her. This was the result of her own actions. She had tried to manipulate me and destroy my life, but in the end, she had destroyed her own. And the most important thing was that she realized it far too late. I didn't feel anger or resentment, just peace. I was finally free from her influence. Now, I live my life, free from her manipulations. I continue doing what brings me joy, without the need to look back. My mother is out of my life, and her past no longer has any power over me. It was a long battle, but I won. And most importantly, I will never let anyone play with my life again.